Welcome. I'm so glad to see you all. My name is Costis Portopapas. I am the Artistic and General Director of Opera Santa Barbara. Thank you. I'm going to keep this short because everybody else who's going to talk today is far more important and far more interesting. But I would like, first of all, to thank the Japanese American Citizens League and the Sister City TOBA organization for partnering with us and organizing this very, very special event. I would also like to thank Bob Sedivi for the beautiful music before, and to say that I'm very thrilled to welcome you here for a very, very interesting and important conversation that starts with our upcoming opera, An American Dream. I'd like to say that it's a piece that I've dreamed of producing here in Santa Barbara since I first saw it in 2017, and it turns out it's a piece that is extremely important here in our community. As you'll hear, the story of the opera is also the story of a lot of our fellow Santa Barbarans. I'd like to say that I'm grateful to be working for a company that dares to produce these kinds of works, and I'd like to express my gratitude to the Board of Directors of Opera Santa Barbara for making all this possible. Thank you for being here today, and I would like to introduce the Mayor of Santa Barbara, Randy Rouse.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I am on. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Number one, welcome into Santa Barbara. Welcome to our Santa Barbara Library, one of our great treasures. But along with that, it's so to recognize the different cultures that make up Santa Barbara, because Santa Barbara is an amalgam of a lot of cultures from all over the world, that as you look outside, we're smart enough to settle and be a part of our fabric, and not the least of which is the Japanese culture that goes back many generations. And a couple generations represented right here with my friend Roque. But it's important that we celebrate these things and have them in a cultural format such as this, to really celebrate and to really understand what parts of Santa Barbara are our roots, what makes up Santa Barbara, and all the different parts of the world that end up right here in probably one of the most beautiful cities in the world with touchy technology. But anyway, so with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Linda to give you the rest of the show.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm Linda Matthews. I'm the president of Santa Barbara TOBA, Japan's sister city organization. And we are really happy to be one of the co-sponsors of this event today with Santa Barbara Opera. We're so lucky to have this professional opera corps here. It's just amazing. And their capability of bringing such a new work that touches poignantly on some very serious issues is just fantastic. So thank you all for doing all the work to bring it. We want to just very quickly mention that right after World War II, General Eisenhower, soon to be President Eisenhower, had seen it all. He had been there, the worst in Europe. He had seen what had gone on in Asia. And he knew there was one way to bring people together and to help prevent this sort of cataclysm in the future, and that's person-to-person diplomacy. And so in 1956, Sister Cities International was formed. We were started just about 10 years after, and Santa Barbara, TOBA, Japan, Sister City is the oldest in town. And we're very proud of that. We have 55 years and going. We've also had a student exchange to promote person-to-person diplomacy for at least 27 out of the last 30 years. We've had a little hiatus due to things we all understand. I have some information over on the table about a couple of our programs. One of them is a youth art competition, and our entry from our sister city of TOBA, Japan, took a prize in that a few years ago. We're hoping for more entries from youth on this year's theme about food and sustainability in times of climate crisis. That's a hard one to say. So I want to also say thank you for the participation of our Japanese American community here and the folks who had ties with the forced deportations and relocations. It's a big part of Santa Barbara history that is just now really being discussed. The panel will enlighten you further. And for our Jewish community friends who are also intrigued as to how this opera relates to their historical tragedy, we welcome you. And I would like to now introduce the woman who will really lead the show, Nina. Nina is the cultural consultant on this production and has been with it since the beginning. And she's the one to tell you all about it and to sing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I first just want to say thank you all so much for being here today. I am born and raised in Santa Barbara, California, and although I don't live here anymore, it's always wonderful to be home, and to see so many of you here supporting us means the world to me. I wanted to tell you a little bit about this opera, and it was premiered in is this working or no? No. Is my voice loud enough? If I just speak with my opera voice, great. So we premiered this opera in 2015 in Seattle at Seattle Opera, and it takes two stories that were discovered as Seattle Opera went out into their community and asked the question, if you had to leave tonight and could only bring with you what you could carry, what would you bring with you? They had hundreds of answers to this question. And from these answers, they took two women's stories who both took place during World War II and brought them together and fictionalized them a little bit. And that is what became how American Dream came to be. So it takes a Japanese-American family that is forced to leave their home in the Pacific Northwest, and they are incarcerated during World War II. It takes a German Jewish woman who has come to the United States with her American husband for safety. And it melds these two stories together, and what you get is a story of what is home and what does it mean to be home. So when this opera was workshopped before we did the world premiere, the feedback was that my character, the character of Mama, didn't have enough to sing. And so the opera company hired the librettist and the composer to write an aria for me. And the way this aria came to be is my grandparents were incarcerated in Poston, Arizona, and my grandmother was interviewed. And from her interview came my aria that I sing. She sat in the front row opening night in Seattle, and she's been gone for 7 years now, but every time I sing this aria, I get to think about her and everything she went through during World War II. I'm going to do a little singing, and then we are going to get to the panel. This is A House Someday from An American Dream. before we move on to the panel, I would like to introduce a couple other Opera Santa Barbara people who are here today. Many thanks to Tim Okurzo, who is our principal pianist, and also our conductor, Eiki Isomura, is back there. And our director, Richard Gammon, is around here somewhere, right back there. So as we move forward, before we go into the next part, I would like to introduce Takako Wakita, who is going to tell you a little bit about the Hina dolls here and speak on behalf of the sister cities.
Thank you, Naina. Thank you, Naina. Okay. First of all, I'd like to introduce today's honored guests, internment camp survivors. Please stand up, okay? Chiyo Suzuki. Is Chiyo Suzuki is here? Right. She was at Boston, Arizona. Ken Ando, please. Okay. He was in rural Arkansas. Did I say it right? Rural Arkansas. That's right. Next person is Bobby Kono. Bobby Kono. She's 100 years old. And Ken Fujino-san. Fujita-san, sorry. Ken. He was born in Boston. Sorry, Bobby Kono was Hard Mountain in Wyoming. Right, Wyoming, that's right. And Fumio Sato. He was in rural Arkansas also, right? Yeah. And of course, we have Hideko Maris and Roki Fukumura, but they will be introduced later, okay? Now, I am going to talk about these Hina dolls. Why we have these Hina dolls? Because of the story of the opera, which she explained. A daughter of this family who went to the internment camp, she hid a Hina doll under the floor when they left. And then that is the important part of this story of the opera. That's the reason I have Hina dolls here. And we have 3 sets. Okay, this one belongs to Keiko Yamamoto. Where is Keiko? Thank you very much. This one belongs to Hina Haitsuka. Where is Hina Haitsuka-san? Haitsuka-san, thank you very much. She left. Okay, the biggest one belongs to Toba group, which is, donated to our group. And these dolls are decorated for the Girls' Day, which is May 3rd. Girls' Day, which is called also Hina Festival, Doll Festival, or Momonosekku. That means Peach Festival also, okay? And it has tiers like this. The top one, the emperor and the empress. The second tier is 3 court ladies. And the third one, 5 musicians. Next one, 2 ministers, left and right. And if you see this set, it has more layers. That one, 3 servants. Some says 3 officers, but 3 servants. And this has more layers like this, more tiers. Those are the food on the tray and sake bottles, of course, and mochi cake and others. Okay, I mentioned Girls' Day. Is there a Boys' Day? Oh yes, it was. It's the May the 5th, but now it is called Children's Day. So, and it's a national holiday now, okay? And what they do for the Girls' Day. Girls wear kimonos, get together, and eat traditional food. Chirashi sushi, it is called. It's the sushi, all the ingredients are scattered on the sushi rice. And drink amazake, that is a sweet sake-ly drink. And also they sing a song like this. 明かりをつけましょう、ぼんぼりに。ぼんぼり are those candle holders. お花を生けましょう、桃の花。Well, 桃の花 is a peach flower, and it's supposed to be the peach flower like this. We have a totally different flowers today. 五人林の笛太鼓、今日は楽しいひな祭り。Thank you.
I would now like to invite our panelists up to have a seat here, and as you're coming up, I will just give a little introduction to each one of them. First is Dr. Paul Mori. He has deep roots and connections to Santa Barbara and to Japanese American history, and a passion for keeping his family stories alive and sharing them. For over 20 years, Paul has been a reviewer of the Japanese and Japanese American books for the Seattle-based International Examiner. His decade-long volunteer work for the Asian American Affinity Group for the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation has brought opportunities to host and moderate many question and answers. He is also an accomplished musician, an alum of Westmont College, holds a master's degree in bassoon performance, and a doctorate in orchestral conducting from Peabody Conservatory. He is the director of Santa Barbara's Primetime Band. And the former director of the Santa Barbara Reading Orchestra, and has been on the music faculty at Westmont since 2005. Thank you for being here. We also have Roki Fukumura, and he was incarcerated in Poston, Arizona at the age of 19. He just celebrated his 100th birthday last November, and he attended Santa Barbara High School and played baseball as a shortstop for the Dons. He is still working at Tri-County Produce for 30 hours a week. And he was recently featured in The Independent, a 6-page article that came out about him last December. Thank you, Roki, for being here. And we also have Hideko Malas, and she was 5 years old when she was incarcerated. She and her family were picked up on Cabrillo Boulevard, first went to Santa Anita, and then moved to Gila, Arizona. Her grandfather came to Santa Barbara in 1904, and since then, her family has been living here, except for the 3 years that they were incarcerated. Her grandmother was a midwife and delivered Roki in 1922 on a farm on the Mesa. Hideko, thanks for being here. I'm going to start by asking Paul to give us a little history story. Talk a little bit about Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066. Tell us a little bit about your family's experiences here in Santa Barbara.
For those who lived through December 7th, 1941, it was like a day like no other. In the same way that 9/11 was, where people can remember exactly where they were and what they did, they remember that event. Yet I can't imagine what my parents thought or what they must have been going through on that day. It would be a nightmare that would continue for years. My mother's story is particularly dramatic, and it's easy to imagine that any dreams that she had of a career, marriage, or a normal life were dashed in the moment that Pearl Harbor was attacked. The cascade of tragic events to come were catastrophic and would leave scars that would never heal. Acting on prepared lists, the FBI and the local police immediately picked up suspects and community leaders. Tragically, some were held in federal penitentiaries into 1946, a full year after the end of the war. Buddhist priests, Christian ministers, Japanese business and community leaders, judo instructors, Japanese language school teachers were targeted, but not legally charged. Being Japanese or associating with Japan was the ultimate liability. Ironically, the entrepreneurs, the ones who were most successful in business and who had achieved the American dream, lost the most. Wives were separated from their husbands, children from their fathers, and communities lost leaders who could have calmed the waters. My mother, who was just 21, moved into the home of a woman whose husband had been picked up by the FBI. The two women improvised and did their best to run the farm, picking up the fragmented pieces. Ironically, Mrs. Masukane's son wasn't there to help because he was serving in the U.S. Army. Many others were rounded up with the flimsiest of evidence. Fishermen who had ocean charts or radios, tools of their trade that kept them safe, were picked up for those things alone and sent to faraway prisons. My father's family was probably suspect because their farm on the mesa where Lazy Acres is today was adjacent to the Santa Barbara Lighthouse. My father described the FBI agents just like those that you see in the movies. The community quickly learned that possessing anything Japanese, especially anything written in Japanese, was a liability and could land you into trouble. Precious heirlooms were burned or destroyed. And for my immigrant grandparents, those tokens that bridged their memories back to Japan dissolved with their destruction. Other items were buried with the hope that they could be retrieved once a nation recovered from its hatred, but there was little hope of that back then. Curfews were put in place, travels limited, bank accounts frozen. The results were catastrophic, in some cases deadly. A gang of angry Filipino workers, armed with shovels and pitchforks, surrounded my mother's family home, demanding their pay and threatening violence upon the family. Thankfully, someone my grandfather hardly knew, no accident, an Italian immigrant, lent the money to him. A potential disaster was averted, other than the nightmares that my aunt still talks about 80 years later. Not so fortunate was a Japanese farm family who lost their lives in a similar incident in Imperial Valley, and their child survived by hiding and running away. Worse things were to come. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, largely upon the recommendation of the U.S. Army General John L. DeWitt. Carefully crafted to avoid court challenges, the document avoids mentioning any reference to race or any reference to Japanese, even though clearly that was its intent. With its signing, carte blanche was given to the military, and General Witt started the removal of 120,000 Japanese Americans into what were camp prisons. Most were on Native American reservations, but all were in isolated and desolate locations. It's hard to imagine the number of people. 120,000 people. If you think of 80,000 people who live in Santa Barbara, it was 1.5 times that number. And the majority were American citizens. Those American-born Japanese initially thought their citizenship would protect them, but they were soon to be proved wrong. Although the FBI and naval intelligence recommended against wholesale removal, General DeWitt was unmovable and proudly vocal. His repeated phrase, JAP is a JAP, and a piece of paper meaning citizenship doesn't mean a thing. And the quote rang through into the public through the news media. Rumors of spurious newspaper stories, many of them Hearst newspapers, of sabotage and violence fueled the fires of public fear, which then became uncontrolled burns. None of them were true, and by the end of the war, not a single case was proven, nor any charge brought forward. Even California Governor Earl Warren, the same Chief Justice Warren, who championed civil rights in the 1960s, and for whom Earl Warren showgrounds in Santa Barbara are named, promoted the removal of Japanese Americans from California. To the end of his life, he never publicly apologized. Japanese Americans had to face the harsher setbacks with the evacuation order. Businesses, farms, livelihoods, and the content of homes had to be liquidated in short order, and in some critical areas, it was a matter of days. The people of San Pedro of Terminal Island had 24 hours. With little sympathy in the larger society, opportunists hovered like vultures and waited for the inevitable bargains that would come. Rival farmers relished new lands soon, grabbing acres they had long coveted. Decades-old livelihoods, all built on the foundation of the American dream, disappeared from an entire community's grasp, all because they looked like the enemy. No one with the least amount of Japanese heritage was safe. Even if you can imagine, orphans were taken out of orphanages and sent to these camps. In order to be absolutely thorough, anyone with 1/16 blood was subject to removal. With the order given, entire household belongings had to be reduced to a suitcase or two, to only what a person could carry. And because no one was told where they were being taken or for how long, the choices were not only difficult, but impossible. What kind of clothing to take? Pity the desert farmers who were imprisoned in the harsh winters of Hart Mountain, Wyoming. The War Relocation Administration, first headed by Milton Eisenhower, the same brother of Dwight Eisenhower, the general and president of the United States, he was the first administrator, and his task was massive. And before resigning a year later, he wrote for the record, unbelievably, "Someday this country will regret what we're doing today." Without foresight or of consequences, the task of relocating, feeding, and housing 120,000 people resulted in inhumane treatment, injury, and even death. Yet the government machinery moved forward ineptly, but relentlessly. Initially, many were moved to horse racetracks. Santa Anita in California is the most famous, and to fairgrounds housed in livestock stalls. At the constructed campsites, such as Manzanar, Gila River, Poston, and so forth, the barracks were makeshift and hastily constructed. The shoddy building standards and green wood would soon result in gaps that would easily allow the wind, sand, and the elements to permeate. The bus ride from my mother's family, from Imperial Valley to Poston, was a day-long journey. In the stifling heat that rose every moment, windows were closed and shades pulled down. They didn't want them to know where they were being taken. There were some mothers with infants, and during the course of the day, the milk they had brought inevitably spoiled and soured. Upon arriving in the evening, there was no food for anyone, and more importantly, no infant formula or milk. Authorities never anticipated such a situation where young children would have to be provided for. Especially in the beginning, there are many failures of foresight. Medical care was non-existent, schooling for children was improvised, and food was canned or preserved, and meals endlessly repetitive. The conditions were unbelievably harsh and horrible, and you'll hear it from Roki and Hideko. My mother, when she arrived, by the way, they gave people inoculations, and she reacted badly. And my grandfather hunted for a doctor because there wasn't any, and finally found a Japanese veterinarian and nursed her back to health. Starting in 1943, some avenues for leaving the camps were made available, but a lot of red tape and so on, restrictions, and they could not move back to California. My father applied and tried to start a life in Cleveland, Ohio. However, with the lifting of the ban of Japanese Americans serving in the military and the draft reinstated, my father ended up in the U.S. Army, even when his immigrant parents were still incarcerated. And the funny story about that is the U.S. Army taught my father Japanese. With the war winding down in 1945 and peace within sight, Japanese Americans were allowed to leave the prison camps in small numbers. The final camp closings were nearly a year later in 1946, in March. But life out of the camps, back in their hometowns, was just as difficult, or even more so. The world they knew was forever gone, and there was no returning to the familiar places that now only existed in memories. Because of laws that prohibited land ownership from anyone from China or Japan, the places they left in 1942 were now in the hands of strangers. Few people would lease land or home or apartments to the returning Japanese, and the only jobs available were the most menial, things like farm labor, servant work, even if you had a college degree or skilled training. The Japanese and Buddhist church here in Santa Barbara, just a couple blocks down here between Anacapa and Santa Barbara Street, served as hostels, and people lived there for quite a time after the war. My father picked vegetables in Guadalupe, and my maternal grandparents were hired by longtime Olympic chair Avery Brundage to care for his Montecito estate. The destruction of the Japanese-American community wasn't due to scorched earth of air raid bombings, but it was just as thorough. Of the many Japan towns prior to the war, only 3 survived: San Francisco, San Jose, and Little Tokyo. In Santa Barbara, only 2 churches, and only into the 1960s. Of the thousands of Japanese in Imperial Valley where my mother was born, only about 100 residents returned, and the once vibrant Japantown in El Centro was forever gone. The specter of suspicion and prejudice was long-lasting, largely because the government made the case for internment because even they, with the best experts, could not discern a loyal Japanese from a non-loyal one, and that convinced America that these people could not be trusted. After the war, people felt free to lash out at strangers if they looked Japanese. Imagine this. My mother and aunt were enjoying a beautiful sunny day in Los Angeles, shopping like young people do, enjoying and breathing the air of freedom for the first time in years. As they crossed the street, a complete stranger, a woman, spat in their faces and hurled racial insults just as foul. They never forgot, and for years never revealed it to me or anybody else, the shame they suffered that day. Denying housing on the basis of race was common, even in Santa Barbara, for many years after World War II. When my parents were married, they went apartment shopping like you would expect newlyweds to do. Going from place to place, they were repeatedly told, "Oh, sorry, we already rented that out," or, "Oh, that sign, we forgot to take it down." But even more harshly, they said, we don't rent to mixed tenants. We don't mix tenants. After a day of excuses, my father had had enough and told the schoolteacher landlord that he was a U.S. Army veteran, and as a teacher, she should know better. She relented, and my folks had their first nest to build. It was not an accident that my father would buy a home on his beloved Mesa as soon as he was able to do. In the midst of this American tragedies, there were heroes as well. And it's important to remember that there will always be those who will always stand up for justice. The worst of humanity often brings out the best. To name a few of the most famous, Reverend Herbert Nicholson, who made it his personal mission to help Japanese Americans and rallied support in the larger Quaker community. Walt Woodward, the Bainbridge Island newspaperman, who stood up valiantly for his Japanese neighbors and who was the inspiration for the hero in the novel Snow Falling on Cedars. Miss Breed, the San Diego, a humble librarian in a children's library in San Diego, who corresponded with hundreds of her former children clients like a surrogate mother throughout the course of the war and for decades afterwards. There's certainly others whose deeds and courage few will ever know apart from or outside of family stories. The Shapiros, one of the many Jewish families who understood hardship and prejudice. They provided jobs for my mother and for my aunt. And Eleanor Bickman, the German-American beauty shop owner who employed my aunt after the war when no one else would, and who fiercely protected her from customers who dare insult her with wartime hate. There are lessons for this for all of us, for this nation, for this community, and for individuals. What are those lessons? The uncontrolled power of fear that overpowers reason. Fake news stories that do more damage than the authors ever imagined. And people in leadership who succumb to hearsay and lies. And finally, maybe the most important lesson, the need to get to know the other, people who are different from ourselves. So I now invite you to listen to not my stories, but the stories of my guests, of our guests today. Thank you very much.
Roki, I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about Santa Barbara Japanese American community pre-World War II. Growing up Japanese American here myself, I didn't really know very many other Japanese Americans, but I've heard that it was a thriving community prior to World War II. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, prior to World War II, the community was small. The population was small of the Japanese community. And we all have more or less gardening, or the older people were the one that had the job because we were all minors yet in that period. And we helped our folks as much as we can. But most were all minors. And when the war broke out, we were helping my father. In my family, my father was a farmer, so I helped him with the garden and produce and packing and things with the vegetables. But when the Pearl Harbor attack, that stunned everybody, not only us, but the whole world. And we guessed, well, what's going to happen from now? And we were guessing, but the community was had an organization called Japanese American Citizens League, who overlooked a lot of problems that we had. And they gave us an order that whatever you do, please obey the government. Whatever they say, we'll obey. And do not do sabotage or anything, that sort of thing, and keep our name clean. So when the war started, and there were certain areas that there was more security, like Treasure Terminal Island. People were told to leave, and they only had their furniture and whatever they had to get rid of, but who can get rid of it in 24 hours? And they never gave us a place to put them. They said, just go. So they had to leave. And so we were fortunate to have a man called Mr. Coleman that we rented our property where my dad farmed. And he told us that whatever happens, I'll help you. And when they declared that West Coast was supposed to be evacuated, the Western Defense Command in San Francisco gave an order that all Japanese, regardless, citizens or non-citizens, all Japanese be evacuated out of the West Coast. So they gave us choice to go to inland, and my family, my father's family, went to Fresno region called Reedley, and we settled there for a while because we had a friend that told us that a farmer would accept us, and we put a big tent and we stayed in that area. Then when we got an order saying all Japanese be evacuated and taken into internment camp, then we had an order, and we all obeyed it, and we all volunteered to leave our place and take our suitcase, one suitcase, that's all we had, and get into the internment camp. And there were so many internment camps, I don't know how many, but it must have been about a dozen of them. And there was 2 in Arizona, and we went to posts in Arizona. Was it the Indian reservation? Most of them were Indian reservations, camps that we went to. And as Japanese, they're very energetic, and they grow their own vegetables and things to make us self-supporting, because we didn't get too much help from the government. And then we stayed in a barracks, and there was a tar paper barrack. We had spaces in the floor, and I never been in a tornado, but when the big wind came and blew the dust into our barrack after we ran in there, we were suffering in the house, in the barracks. So that was one of the things that we had to overcome at times. And they start putting linoleums in. We had no heating during the winter. Then start putting in oil stoves to give us a little heat. And me being just 19, we had to volunteer to do a lot of work, and I became a cook for our 300 people with about 3 other helpers. And that was one of the most adventurous things I had to overtook being a youngster. So I worked from 3:30 in the morning to 8:30 at night every other day. And we didn't have too much nightlife because we had to get up in the morning, next morning again at 3:30. And my love was sports, and we played baseball every night. And when my time came to clean up, well, we had a volunteer come help my time to clean the kitchen, and I played baseball and basketball and every night to keep me and ourselves sort of amused in a way. But I'm not an adventurous people, so I never traveled all around the camps. But the Japanese people made amphitheaters. They built high school with Dobie ground. And they had a clinic. And so we didn't have modern equipment, but we survived. And like most of the Japanese are very energetic, and they try to help each other in camp. And so when we left, when we were in camp, they were trying to remove a lot of people out of the camp and relocate to other parts of the country. But when my time came, and the Army Corps invited me and tell me, here's a paper, you could leave. And I says, no, I'm going to California. And the Army says, no, you can't go to California. You're not allowed to. Well, then I'm staying right here. And I gave the paper back to the captain, and he says, well, you're sort of arrogant person. So I said, Sergeant, take this man back to camp. But you know, what can they do? I'm in camp already, and they can't remove me anywhere else. So when I went back, there was another group of Army Corps persons came in and asked me, where do you want to go? And I said, he was a general, and I said, General, I won't leave this camp till I get to California. That's my home. I've never been out of this California, and I'm going back there. And he gave me a 2-week furlough to go to Central Cal, and I had a friend that owned a property there, and he raised watermelons and peaches, and we enjoyed 2 weeks of stay there. We came back, and about 3 months later, Japan surrendered, and so the government allowed us to come back to California. And the man that rented our property, he never rented to anybody else, and we had our furniture stacked in there, all our furniture, and he accepted us back, and we start earning our own living, not farming, because the farmers would be a little hard to overtake our time. So we all split up and became gardeners, and I was a farm helper, and my brother-in-law was a lemon taker. And so from there on, we generated our life into tried to be a normal people. And the people that I work for, they really treated me good. And after a while, I became a laborer. And so even today, everybody is working and owning their home and raising families. And I'm great to be American. And I wouldn't trade this for any place in the world. So people, I'm 100, and you people become physically well, keep your body well, and with the blessing of the Lord, thank you.
One of my favorite words that I like to use when talking about the Japanese American community is resilient and resilience. And no matter what, they were put through, it was okay with a smile on their face and obedient, and yes, we can, and yes, we will, come back and live good lives and be proud of who we are and where we come from. And I think that's just so amazing about the Japanese American community. So thank you for sharing your story. One of the things that my grandmother used to talk about when she talked about being in Poston was that it was kind of the end of the nuclear family. That the kids started playing with the kids, and it was a lot of fun. And the older people would eat with the older people, and all of a sudden, this idea of family changed. And I know you were just 5 years old when you were in camp, and so I'd love to hear a little bit about your memories as a child, and any other stories you're interested in talking about.
After Roki, it's very difficult to. But being a child, there was still a family, and so it was not a bad experience. You had your mother and father who protected, and your sisters. I had 2 sisters, and we kind of hung out together all the time, and it felt safe and secure, and we didn't have bought toys or anything, but there's all these things in the desert that amused us, sticks and stones and critters, insects and whatnot. We really had a very protected, close time.
You have schooling?
Oh, yes.
Talk about schooling a little bit.
Well, there was a school that we walked to, and I found when we came back to Santa Barbara that they were pushing us harder in those schools so when we came back to school in Santa Barbara, it was a piece of cake. So.
What was life like when you came back to Santa Barbara?
I think we were one of the fortunate families that came back to our house in Santa Barbara. Everybody else's houses or whatever were sold or whatever. But by a legal fluke, our family maintained the property on Canon Perdido Street, which was right next door to the Buddhist church. And my father came back earlier to put plumbing and electrical back in the house because that was all stripped out of the house. And we also were fortunate enough to have the only car in our neighborhood because it was stored in the WRA warehouse during the war, and we were able to pick that up on the way home. So my dad was taxi service to everybody that came to the Greyhound to go to the hostel, which was the Buddhist church.
And how do you think that your incarceration has affected your immediate family, your kids, your grandkids? Is it something you talk about with them? Is it something that stories are told?
Not very much, no. I don't have kids, so that part is not part of it. But I don't think that was much of the focus of what happened after we came back from camp. Everybody made their way. And I personally had a business in Santa Barbara for 40 years. And it was a fabulous business. I miss it.
So a question that I found some interviews recently of my grandmother being asked a lot of these questions, and a question that she was asked that I was fascinated by the answer to is, how would you react if you were asked to do this today? Would it be as easy, yes, I will go, or would there be?
Well, when that question comes up, I don't think it'll ever happen. But if that question comes up, we're all parents now, or grandfathers, or grandmothers. So we have to take a different step if something like that happened. At that time when the war started, we were all minors. There were very few people that was 21, except my sister was, a couple of them were 21, but they had no money to be buying things. So, but now everybody is different. Now their parents have houses and businesses and things. So it'd be a different attitude.
I would like to ask Paul, something we were talking about a little bit is how it has affected your generation or my generation to have our family members incarcerated. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
No, I'm not only short, but the cord is short too. It had, everyone's story is a little bit different of my generation, so I can't speak for the entire generation. But my parents, they didn't tell these stories. They kind of wanted to go on with their lives. I didn't find out these things until they were quite older, as most of the people of my generation did not, post 1970s, post civil rights, and people started talking about those experiences, especially as they got older and knew that if they didn't tell them now, that those stories would never get out. But as far as me, there was all that stigma of growing up, even still for when I was growing up in Santa Barbara, people would just not thinkingly would say on December 7th every year, "Remember Pearl Harbor," to me, even in grammar school, for example. And I would dread every December 7th. Who's going to be this year? Where is it going to come from? And it affected us in kind of small ways, where I remember even as a small child, my father said, if you haven't noticed, I'm Asian, but that Asian thing where you got to be productive and you got to work hard and all those kinds of things, it was really intensified because I remember as a small child, my father sitting both my brother Forrest, who's here, and I down and saying, when it comes to that job when you grow up, if you're just as good as the next guy, you're never going to win. You're never going to get it. You've got to be twice as good as the next guy. And it was a lot of pressure as a little kid. And other things, I don't have a Japanese name. Oftentimes the tradition was that going back to my parents' generations, they would get an American name as well as a Japanese name. That was the immigrant parents would do that for their children. And that followed suit for my generation, the Sansei generation, the third generation. Caused a big scandal in our family because I don't have a Japanese name. In a sense, in trying to protect children, as all parents do, they had to make compromises of certain ways or others, and to protect us in well-meaning ways that kind of separated us from Japan and Japanese culture. And it's sad. The example the most glaring example of this is we were not taught Japanese, except my parents would not speak Japanese unless they had their secret code and they didn't want us to understand. I got smart enough though in graduate school. I said, I'm going to figure out that code. No, I'm just kidding. But it took and not knowing the language not only separated us from the culture in that kind of sense, it also separated us from our grandparents. My grandfather was really proficient in English, my mother's father. I mean, really good, to the point that he thought he was going to be picked up by the FBI because he was a community leader, in a sense that because he could speak English better than anybody else. However, my grandmother spoke next to nothing. And she gave us love. She showered us with all the love she could. But having those kind of conversations that you would love to have with your grandparents could not happen. And so that was the motivation finally, after she was long gone, when I said, I keep saying someday I'm going to learn Japanese and work really hard, but it's very hard to learn a language when you've past past the time of adolescence. And so in many ways, it's a strange kind of thing that happened in terms of separating. And if you meet Japanese Americans from Hawaii, and you meet Japanese Americans from the mainland here, there's a certain kind of confidence and a certain kind of personality, part of its island culture, of course, from Hawaii. But part of it is that American Japanese had always wanted to be under the radar and kind of be hidden from the rest of society. You don't make a big deal of your Japanese-ness. And you can see it distinctly in personalities and how people relate. And that's kind of a big deal. I hope that answers some questions for you.
Thank you. We would like to open it up to any questions from the audience. I know people have questions. Please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Valerie Yoshimura Sansei, family from Hawaii, actually pulled. But Roki, I'm really intrigued by, we always say, oh yeah, the kids did baseball saved us, is that text. Can you speak about the recreational activities and how were they, like who played them? Did everyone play? It was only the 19-year-olds?
Can you talk about sports at camp? Who played them? How were they arranged? Who set up the games?
Did it save you, as the text suggests?
We had a little committee that, like anywhere else, where they gather this people and then start having a little league, and we abide by the rules of their schedules. And of course, sometimes we couldn't make it because of our job, but most of the time we did, and I did. I made time to play. So we had a schedule of going all the time, and I'm happy to say that the team I've been in, we always were the tops.
That's what my grandma said about her team, too. She said her team was always the best. Yes, another question.
Did you play against children of the guards at all?
Oh, did you play against any of the children of the guards?
Where?
The guards, the guards' children at the camp?
Guards?
Yeah. Were there the children from the guards, the people who were guarding Poston?
No. They were just
No.
18.
No children.
Some of the local high schools would play against.
Some of the local high schools would?
Yeah.
Just Japanese. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Just this very morning, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and part of that conversation had to do with the idea that some non-Japanese did help, did kind of look after properties and so on. My question is, was that just a tiny bit? How did that, what experiences were there about people, your neighbors, helping you, taking care of your property for the years that you were incarcerated? How did that work?
Yeah. So how were, when Japanese Americans were taken away, how many people came back to places that were still there with people who had taken care of their properties? We had a story when we did the opera about that these people came and they spoke before the opera on stage. And it was a Mexican family and a Japanese family. And the Mexican family had said, we will take care of your farm. They farmed it for them when they were gone. They, saved the money for them. And then when the Japanese family came back, everything was there. And then the Japanese family said, we would like to split this land with you. And then they farmed it together. But I mean, there are stories either way, both ways, of people taking care of properties and people coming back to absolutely nothing and being, taken advantage of and having to sell things for, pennies on the dollar.
My piano teacher in Santa Barbara here, Susie Tamura, Tamura family, and the Issei father was the caretaker at All Saints Church in Montecito. They said, will you protect our belongings while we're gone? And after the war, nothing was left. They said, we didn't think you were coming back, and so sorry. She said there was just everything was kind of trashed of all their belongings, all their valuables, and only things that they didn't want were gone. But like I said, there were people who did protect farms. A couple of farm families in Morro Bay area, San Luis area, that happened. Some churches did step up. The diocese up in the Episcopal diocese in Washington State, they were angels, and so on. So it was kind of a mixed experience in a lot of ways. But that's the way people are. They're always good people, right? And there's also people that are always going to take advantage. That's kind of life.
Your landlord took care of your property while you were at camp.
Yeah, the Japanese non-born were not allowed to own any property. And that's one of the reasons why we all rented our properties. And so we had no home to come back, and a lot of them didn't come back. And most of them went into East Coast, like Birdsides. They had a defense plant, and they hired laborers, and a lot of Japanese made villages there in New Jersey, because that was their job there, and they had a job. So that was one of the reasons why a lot of them didn't come back, because they had no properties, because they couldn't own the property.
My mother had a piano that she treasured that was taken over to a friend's house, and they kept it until after the war, and then we retrieved it. But everything else that was stored in the garage, they were all taken, or everything was ransacked. But we had the piano, and she was very happy.
My family tells a story of my great-grandmother who was bedridden with arthritis, and basically the government said, you can either stay here in the city hospital by yourself and everybody else will be taken to camp, or you can rent yourself your own ambulance to drive you from LA to post in Arizona. My great-grandfather had been already taken away by the FBI and had been gone for months. And so it was up to the kids to figure out how to scrape together enough money. They sold scrap metal, and they scraped together enough money to be able to bring their mother via ambulance to Arizona. And then they also had to pay for her to get back after camp. And it was just ruin for them. I saw a question over here somewhere in the back.
Now, it's not a question, but it's a comment, kind of. I met George Takei, famous actor, and he's written a book, maybe some of the people here have read it, but I'll never forget something he told to me. He was a child in one of the camps, and of course he had to go to school. And in the school was a tar paper shack. And in the morning they had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And he never forgot the last words. Liberty and justice for all. Something for all of us to remember.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes?
What kind of reparations were made for these people?
I can talk about that, or do you want to talk about that? You go ahead.
So they can probably tell you a little bit better. So when the camps were closed and people were leaving, it was a matter of just a few dollars that were allowed to them. Do you remember how much money you got when you left camp?
How much money did you get when you left camp? Do you remember?
$19.
No, that was what you got.
How much did they give you
when you left camp?
Start your life?
Nothing, but there was a few, nominal amount, but not much. But in 1988, a very courageous Congress pushed through legislation called H.R. 9066, named after the executive order, which resulted in reparations to any surviving person when that resolution was signed. My Uncle Bill had passed away weeks before that, so that family got nothing. Only to living survivors, it was $20,000. Thank you. But the important in 1988, President Reagan, signed it. No, and the story that I have is it came with a letter from the president, from the White House, and I remember my father holding the letter and saying, and holding the check and saying, "Oh, if we had this in 1946," right? he says, I got to save this letter. After he passed away, I looked everywhere for that letter. Could not find it. Went through the file cabinets, found a lot of other interesting things about. No, seriously, there's notes that he did for a lecture from Westmont College about his experiences, which is a gold mine of information. But I couldn't find the letter. I finally found it about a month ago. It's in the safety deposit box. So in many ways, it was worth more than gold to have an apology. We can't underestimate the cost of shame upon people's lives and how important an apology can be.
Another question. Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, as a child, I'm not sure if you know this, but I've always been curious about how the schooling was set up. Did your Japanese relatives or friends set it up, or did the government come in and bring teachers, or how did it go?
They had regular school rooms and classes, and the teachers were mostly Japanese people, but there were other Caucasians that came in as teachers too. So we had a full raft of teachers. And my father, who was a woodworker, taught woodworking there was a shop area he was showing woodworking to the high school kids. So, I mean, we had a regular school system, libraries. My mother was a librarian because she was quite a reader, but everybody had a little chore to do.
It varied by the camp in a lot of ways, but initially it wasn't really planned for, and of course they realized they had kids. So a lot of whoever they could recruit from people that were interned there became teachers. And later on, some school districts in the local communities kind of opened up and sent teachers, and people were, paid to come in and do these things. The high school yearbooks that were left for me from my Auntie Yo on my dad's side, oh my gosh, they're gold, because you can see this.
Poetry that was written by students at school.
There's also a book of, there was a high school in near Poston that had this project where the school kids would write letters to the internee kids, and they asked for essays about, write an essay about your experience of whatever your daily experience. That book was turned into a book during the 1940s, right, by that school district. And it's a treasure trove as well. The book was reprinted. It's wonderful. It kind of talks about life in Poston, and I showed it to my aunt, and she says, "Oh, I remember so and so," and oh yeah, and she loves it, and she especially liked the article that wrote about childcare, because my aunt was hired to take care of the little kids, during the preschool kids, and anyways, so.
Let's have one more question. Yes, in the back.
I have a question about the questionnaire and how the morale changed at camp with the questionnaire, and the no-nos versus the yes-yes. Was there rivalry? But how did people feel about others saying yes-yes, no-no to those questions?
So the questionnaire, where there was the no-no boys and yes-yes.
28 and 29.
How did that change?
Yeah, there was no boys. Well, I couldn't blame them either, because they were thrown in camp, and you want to volunteer or not? And they said no. We're going to stay here. And if you were taken in the army, would you go? And she said no, not while we were in camp. So that was it. Well, I was a no-yes boy. I didn't want to volunteer because, I was still 19, and your mind is working. What the heck am I doing in here anyway? So, but the yes part was, we had a selective service while I was here in school, 18 to 26. There was a selective service in town, and I got a report from them when I was in camp. I says, okay, I'll go physical. So I went to Phoenix for physical, and if I was passed, I would have entered the Army. But I had a bone in my knee, and they said, well, you have your physical disability, so they gave me a 4F, so they relieved me from going to the Army. But I was a no yes boy, and if I was past test, yes, I would have been in the Army.
So the question is about a loyalty questionnaire that came to everybody in the camp, and it was put out as a way to try to start this process of releasing people. It was a loyalty questionnaire. Unfortunately, it was thrown together, not really well thought out, based on the kind of allegiances and things. When you join the military, you have to, swear allegiance. You do that, the promise when you join any of the armed services today. Question 28 was, are you willing to pick up arms and serve and fight in the war? That's what Roki was talking about, basically. That was the thing of that. The second question was really problematic because it said, do you forswear any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan or any foreign powers and so on? And you're, basically because the immigrant population was not allowed naturalized citizenship, if they said, yes, I forswear allegiance to Japan, they're stateless, right? They have no rights in the world court. They had no rights whatsoever. What the heck were they going to do? And they had, because everybody had to fill this out that you would serve in the military, that meant children, that meant women, that meant grandparents. So this was a terrible dilemma for people who actually read took these questions seriously, as many did. And it was, in my mother's family, they just said, don't make waves, just say yes, yes, right? That was easy. And it's not like today where you can protest easily, right? And there is a history now in the United States of standing up and saying no to things. So the people that actually said no were stigmatized by the Japanese community and created this incredible rift because you should have just said yes, yes, don't you know? And they were separated and sent to an internment camp just near Klamath, Tule Lake. And Tule Lake was one of those things that you didn't talk about because in the Japanese community, because if you did, then it was kind of a stigma there. It was kind of a real negative thing to be from Tule Lake. Oh, you're one of those who said no, right? It was an ugly situation, an unfortunate one, and a blight upon the Japanese community and otherwise. It's really tragically sad that this thing kind of divided a community in an unfortunate way. If you've seen George Takei's musical called Allegiance, it addresses that particular issue. And it's kind of chilling to actually see the document and reading those questions. You can actually see these now. I saw an actual copy of it. It's very, very hard.
And on that note, we're rounding out our 90 minutes here. I want to thank you all for being here. We know, obviously, seeing so many of you here, how important it is to tell the story and to keep telling it. Opera Santa Barbara just actually added a second performance because the first one has sold so well. So we really hope that you will join us on February 18th. There's a matinee performance and an evening performance at the Lobero. Please come say hi, come listen to the beautiful music, come support this incredible story. And I would like to take a moment to thank our panelists for being here today and for telling us their stories.